Welcome to the podcast of Colombia Reports. My name is Adrian Alsema. Before I begin, I want to remind you that Colombia Reports is funded entirely by readers. If you want to support the website and its podcast, you can contribute a few bucks a month on patreon.com/Colombia Reports. I'm currently connected with Julia Yansura, the Program Director for Environmental Crime and Illicit Finance at the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition, also known as the FACT Coalition. Welcome, Julia.
Thanks for having me.
The report said that according to the U.S. Treasury Department, 2% of the American GDP is assumed to be of illicit financial flow. So that's like 466 billion. And I looked up the GDP of Colombia's entire economy, which is 343 billion. So that's a gigantic economy or industry.
Yeah, so this comes from the IMF, and they estimate that between 2 and 5% of a country's GDP is illicit proceeds.
Of any country.
Obviously, of any country. It doesn't mean that this is only a problem of the US, only a problem of Colombia. However, what we do see is a country whose economy is as big as the United States. Unfortunately, that we're talking about quite a significant amount of illicit revenue. Then we have to consider of those illicit proceeds, some percent are laundered and some percent are reinvested, in quotes, into the illicit economy to cover, operating expenses, materials, to pay employees, all of that.
What's the difference between laundering and reinvesting? I mean, like, isn't that the same thing?
It's a little bit different. I would estimate that around 70% of illicit proceeds are laundered. The laundering process takes dirty money, makes it look clean, so then it can be enjoyed, used typically by those who are in charge of that criminal organization. The operating expenses, doesn't necessarily need to be laundered. It can be, paying workers, say you receive illicit proceeds in cash. You could then pay the workers using that same cash without having to, quote unquote, launder it.
Okay. And I assume that like you focused on the United States not because that system is particularly weak, but basically because it's so big, it automatically would attract dirty money, like from for example drugs, illegal mining, lumbering.
Yeah, so it's a bit of both. Certainly, the U.S. is important because it's such a large economy. It's such a large financial system. The U.S. attracts, unfortunately, dirty funds not only from the U.S. but from other neighboring countries around the world. And then, unfortunately, the U.S. does have a pretty lax anti-money laundering system. We point to specific weaknesses in the report having to do with anonymous shell companies and the idea of beneficial ownership, which is the idea that we want to know the real human beings behind companies. Sounds simple. It's pretty difficult in the US and in other countries around the world for a variety of reasons. And then the other weakness we point to is in the real estate sector. Unfortunately, the US has not had significant anti-money laundering controls over the real estate sector for many, many years. And this has enabled a lot of money laundering linked to environmental crimes as well as other sorts of crimes, both from US illicit actors and international illicit actors.
Yeah, we'll get back to that later. If we could focus on the illegal activities that you've looked into.
Mhm.
In the report, you specifically mentioned gold mining and lumbering. I want to kind of, because like there's like normal criminal activity of which like drug trafficking is the most easy to understand, and that's basically because the commodity is illegal, but it kind of depends on the same financial structures as, for example, illegal mining, which is a legal commodity. So how what do we know about like how bad this situation is in Colombia, like when it comes to, for example, gold mining and lumbering? I got
Yeah,
some
I think
numbers
that,
here myself.
yeah, you point to an important distinction, which is, for criminal groups, if they are involved in something like narcotics, production, transportation, um, that's going to be a highly lucrative illicit economy, but it's going to be fairly risky, because narcotics are, by definition, in most countries and around the world, they're illegal. So you're caught with cocaine, and that's going to be a crime in almost everywhere.
And it doesn't
Um,
mean where you get caught. If you get caught in, let's say, Leticia, Amazonas, you're in as much trouble as if you're caught in New York City, for
sure,
example.
sure, sure. But then you take environmental crime. Um, those illegal logging, illegal mining, it's carried out against the law. But if you're caught with, say, some timber or some gold, it's a lot more difficult for authorities to pinpoint that a crime was actually committed. Compare that to being caught with a backpack full of cocaine. And so this is why increasingly in criminal groups are turning to environmental crime. It's very lucrative, just like narcotics, but the risk of getting caught is a lot lower because it's going to be much, much harder for authorities to actually prove beyond reasonable doubt that that is the product of illegal logging or illegal mining.
Yeah, and you can argue that environmental crimes has a much larger societal impact than, for example, cocaine.
Yeah, yeah. And you can argue in the case of Colombia, it has been argued that illegal gold mining generates more money than narcotics, right? That's a
Yeah,
somewhat controversial claim. I'm not going to weigh in if I agree or disagree, but it gives you a sense of the scale of this illicit economy.
yeah. Um, I want to drop some statistics that I found in your report first, because like both lumbering and illegal mining are major causes for the deforestation of the Amazon. I read in your report that 290,000 square miles of Amazon forest has been deforested since 1978. I looked this up, and that's like territory the size of Pakistan. Um, and in Colombia, some 12,000 cubic square miles have been deforested, which is the size of a country like Belgium. So this is like there's a huge, because I kind of assume that when an illegal armed group or a company that doesn't take the law very seriously, when they deforest a territory, for example, for cattle ranching, that the wood isn't just like thrown aside. I suppose that they are looking for ways to sell that material.
Yeah, I think that what you point to is important, and it's that we see diverse drivers of deforestation in these countries. In some cases, it's groups that are specifically cutting down trees because they want to sell them. That's their primary motivation. In other cases, it's groups who want the lands for other things. They want the lands for cattle. Cattle ranching is a illicit activity that sometimes has illicit elements, especially in countries like Colombia, and it can be quite complicated. We also see groups that are cutting down forest illegally in order to engage in agricultural production. So growing different types of agricultural commodities. And that's complicated. It also creates sort of a complicated supply chain dynamic where, say, you're buying a fruit, or you're buying coffee, or you're buying a palm oil, right? And
Mhm.
how do you make sure as a consumer that you're not purchasing a product that was grown in an area that was illegally deforested?
Yeah. Another thing I read that the revenue of criminal. I just want to like make sure that people understand like that we're not talking about a marginal criminal activity. So the revenue of environmental crime annually, in when it comes to forestry, so the illegal telling of forests is has a revenue of $152 billion a year, and mining $48 billion. In Colombia, if I'm correct, it's like it's estimated to be between $4 and $5 billion, just the illegal mining. Now, it's when it comes to the trade, so let's talk about the exporting of the commodity. Let's focus on gold, for the sake of simplicity. So you got gold that is mined in Colombia illegally. So let's say there's a mine in Antioquia, where I live, and this is a legal mine, and then illegal gold is added to the company results, and at that point it's already legal and exported to the United States, for example, or Dubai or Switzerland. um, how can you, in any part of that trajectory, like in any part of the trade route, how can you check if gold is legal or illegal?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And what you describe actually happens very, very frequently. A lot of times, gold of illicit origin is being exported by formal companies. They're
I
mixing it
know.
in with a legal gold. I think that there are a couple of things. It comes down to knowing who you're doing business with. So for the company in Colombia, they need to know who their providers are. They need to do due diligence. So that's not just accepting a piece of paper that says this gold comes from this place, but actually probably going and doing an in situ visit to that place to make sure that everything adds up, everything looks legitimate.
Is this a
Uh,
legal requirement to do in situ visits?
I do not believe it's a legal requirement, but it is a best practice. Same thing for the US. For the US company that's purchasing this gold from a former Colombian company, they need to do really rigorous due diligence. You know, gold is a challenging sector. We know that there are problems going on in this sector, so it's really important to go beyond just accepting a piece of paper or doing a tick box exercise to actually making sure you know who you're doing business with. Part of this is the in situ visits. Part of it is something I refer to beneficial ownership. It's the idea we want to know who really owns companies. So if you're doing business with another company and it's a high risk sector, it's incredibly important to know not just the name of the company and the company's legal representative, but who actually is behind that company. Beneficial ownership is something that's being implemented. It's a requirement by governments now, but it's also a best practice for the private sector to know, you know, if you're sitting down across the table signing a contract with someone, doing business with someone, you know, who is really behind that company. It's important to check.
But and this is pretty much like not done, is it? Because I'm not naming any names, but I do know of like one particular mine where like a company is like the owner or has like the mining titles of that mine, but then outsources the actual like excavations to a different company, which is dubious at best. And then the mining company that has the titles has a parent company in Panama, and then that Panamanian company has a parent company, if I'm correct, in New York City, and it trades in Toronto. So it's it's quite difficult at any point, like to point out like what the criminal responsibility is of any of the actors in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in the mining sector, we tend to see very complex chains of company ownership. That's not illegal. That is legal according to the law of most countries around the world. However, once you get so many levels of ownership, uh, you start to ask, you know, is there a legitimate business purpose for this? Or is this complexity being created to generate opacity and to hide illicit activity?
Is
So
that
those are
really a
some of the
question?
questions.
Because to me, it's pretty evident.
Yes, but when you talk to big companies that are involved in the sector, you know, they will say, well, you know, there's a reason why we outsource this, or there's a reason why we base operations in this country. And To some extent, that makes
Well, they need to
sense. If they
reduce
can
legal
justify it,
liability, don't they?
yeah. If they can justify it, okay, perhaps. But sometimes there's so much complexity that it seems designed simply to confuse, other businesses and frankly the authorities of those countries.
Okay, so there's an illegal gold operation in Colombia, fictitious. This gold is exported to the United States. What are the financial flows involved in this operation? Like, is like the revenue from the gold sale, is that a return to Colombia, or does this stay in the American system?
Yeah, so the money is typically moving from the US, typically back to Colombia or to another South American a country that's producing gold. Um, that's complicated. As an American, to me, that's very, very troubling that the proceeds from illegal gold mining are moving through our financial system, and we're not doing more about it. I think it's horrifying to me. I think that on the other hand, it gives us a certain opportunity to tackle this problem using the resources of the US. The US can act. It does have a capacity to tackle money laundering cases when they're touching the US financial system. And here we have, in our report, we point to very clear cases where this money is flowing through the US financial system. So I would say to the US authorities, this gives you the capacity to act. Why aren't you acting?
Bu- but also like you have Colombian authorities. So for example, when the Colombian authorities establish that there's illegal activity involved in a gold mine in Colombia, then they would look like they would follow the money. And if that money goes into the United States, or the gold goes to the United States with um, possible complicity of a US company, like, do Colombian authorities have the tools they need to look into that American company and potentially file criminal charges against that company?
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we see is that Colombian authorities, while they are quite active in trying to tackle illicit gold, they are not always using a follow the money approach. So
Mhm.
many of the cases we see in Colombia involve Colombian law enforcement going to a remote area, arresting a couple of local guys, seizing some yellow machinery, or sometimes they'll explode the yellow machinery and then they leave. And there's not necessarily, we're not seeing a lot of follow the money investigations, which is a pity. Where there
Or
are follow
follow
the
the
money,
corporate
hmm
structure,
hmm
like I said, like you got this uh, like these parent companies, one in Panama, then another one in New York, blah blah blah. So Colombian authorities could be pursuing that line of investigation more, you're saying?
Yeah, I think that Colombia needs to do a lot more to follow the money. There are new tools that are now available, mainly due to changes in US law. The US has been implementing what's called the Corporate Transparency Act, or CTA, which is a registry of the real owners of companies. So now, under this new law, Colombian authorities will be able to request information on the real owners of companies in the US or linked to the US, as long as it's part of an active law enforcement investigation. This is a powerful tool for Colombian authorities if they're looking at, illicit gold and companies involved. Um,
Or
they're
any form of money laundering, I assume.
absolutely. Also relevant for narcotics. It's relevant for corruption. You name it.
And
Um,
this Corporate
mhm.
Transparency Act you're talking about, I believe I saw that it only got enacted on the 1st of January.
Yeah, so as of January 1st, companies in the United States are reporting they are beneficial owners. They have to do so before the end of this year. So it's ongoing in the U.S. I would love to sit here and tell you that it's completed and we're already, we solved the problem. But there's, it's a big implementation. There's something like, I want to say over 30 million companies in the U.S. that have to report. So this is going to be a big,
Yeah, but
big
I
database.
actually had a look at the act, and it said that in the beginning that like 2 million businesses are registered in the United States each year. So like you're gonna like if you want to in any way monitor monitor that economic activity, you need gigantic like you need a gigantic apparatus.
Yeah, it's gonna be a big database. But it's up, it's running, it's accepting reports. We've heard on average, it's taking something like 20 minutes for a company to go in and register their information. So it's not a huge lift, but it's providing critical information about who really owns companies. I'll also note, Colombia went through the same thing last year. They implemented their beneficial ownership registry or Registro Único de Beneficiarios Finales, RUB. And so they went through this, they succeeded. There's something like over 80% of Colombian companies have reported their real owners. So hopefully with more countries having this sort of corporate information, we can do more to tackle environmental crimes and other types of crimes.
Yeah, but let's if you'll I think it'll help if you explain like what an anonymous company is, because to me it sounds kind of, I've had a company and then I go to the Chamber of Commerce and I definitely need to like register my name, show my passport. So I'm kind of curious, like how do you create an anonymous company, or how do these structures work?
Yeah, so in the US, company registration happens at the state level, and each state is a little bit different. But up until this Corporate Transparency Act, states were requiring less information to register a company than to use the public library. So you could put down a legal representative. You could put down a PO box, which isn't even like the real place where you work or live. It's just some anonymous mailbox somewhere. And the problem is authorities had no idea who really owns these companies. In Colombia, we see something similar. For the creation of a company, you don't have to put down the real, true person who owns it, or at least you didn't until this change that I mentioned last year. You could register a company, you would put down the legal representative, who could be like a lawyer somewhere in their office, and with that, you have a company created. So even though a company gives it gives sort of a vision of like formality and correctness, the reality is that companies are pretty opaque. And in many countries, we don't know who's really behind them.
And in the US and in Colombia, you said, so now if you register a company, you need to demonstrate the parent company, and this parent company needs to demonstrate who owns that parent company in order for the company to be legally established.
Even better, when you register a company, you have to show the real human beings behind it. So not just a parent company, because going back to your earlier comment, the problem with parent companies is sometimes you get sort of like a like boxes
Yeah,
and
a whole
boxes. What do they call it?
chain.
The Russian nesting dolls of companies, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
idea of beneficial ownership is you have to find the real human being behind that company, even if it's through several layers of corporate ownership.
Okay. Another weakness in the American system you pointed out was real estate. Um, and that one kind of surprised me because I was watching a congressional hearing from 1986. So that's like 30 something years ago, about the Medellin cartel and its finances. And it was already clear then that the Medellin cartel was investing in real estate in the United States. So how come that we're in 2024, and we're is there even like legislation in place to counter this?
Yeah, I'm asking myself the same question is, why has this problem gone on so long? Short
Well,
answer
well, well,
is
I got a proposal. Well, we'll get to that, but
okay.
please.
After 9/11, Congress gave FinCEN the ability to supervise the U.S. real estate sector.
I explain
Um,
FinCEN, please.
FinCEN is the financial intelligence unit of the United States. It's kind of like UIAF in Colombia. So they've had the
Hmm.
capacity under law to supervise the sector, to require anti-money laundering measures from the sector. The thing is, they didn't do it at a national level. They implemented something called geographic targeting orders, or GTOs, which was a piecemeal approach. So what they did is they say, okay, let's take an example. Miami. Miami, we've seen you have some problems with drug related money laundering. So Miami, you're going to have to report. Or New York, we've seen some things going on. New York, you're going to have to report. But there was no national system. And that created a really big problem. One of our ally organizations, Global Financial Integrity, put out a report a couple years ago looking at money laundering in the US real estate sector. And they found that actually many of these money laundering cases in the US were outside of the GTO cities. So, to put it somehow, criminal groups, they knew which cities authorities were regulating, and they
And I
very
suppose this is a
cleverly avoided
changing
the law.
industry too. If you take, for example, how um, if you look at the housing crisis that's going on in the US and Europe, that's mainly because like people are buying homes in order to rent out, and um, so also is it also necessary there that if you purchase a home as a company, for example, that does this Corporate Transparency Act also apply, or
So the Corporate Transparency Act will help. However, there's still some gaps. I think that they have to do with foreign companies. They have to do with trusts. So the Corporate Transparency Act, it's a good solution, but it's not a perfect solution for real estate. That's why FinCEN has rolled out new regulations for residential real estate. And we hope that in the future they will roll out anti-money laundering regulations for commercial. The commercial piece we're still waiting on.
what do you mean? So this only applies to like individuals, not when a company buys real estate property.
Yeah, so the new FinCEN regulations, they've extended anti-money laundering coverage to real estate, but only to residential. So only if it's like a family home, a family ranch, a
You
family
gotta be,
apartment.
but that's such an uh, that's just stupid.
It's a partial solution.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
so okay, so clearly there's like still some legal holes here and there.
Absolutely.
Um, so in your report, you said that the problem with money laundering and like money laundering of the from the proceeds of environmental crimes is uh, quite an industry in the real estate sector. But you also pointed out that law firms. So this is, I suppose, like where lawyers come in and make sure that the FinCEN is happy, um, and you can still launder money.
Yeah, so there's a debate about what we call gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are these professions like lawyers and accountants and others. They're supposed to be sort of at the gates of our financial system, and they're supposed to be keeping us safe by saying like, you can enter, you can't. They're supposed to be sort of protecting our financial system. The reality is when you get a bad lawyer, an unethical lawyer who's, say, working helping a drug cartel to launder money, the reality is that they are so incredibly dangerous because they know how the system works, and they know how to avoid the rules. So they can be incredibly, incredibly dangerous from a money laundering perspective. Their
Well, they're
efforts
pretty
now.
elementary, aren't they?
Yeah, they're absolutely fundamental. If you look at these cases many, many times, I mean, who's, going to set up an anonymous company for you? Who's going to do a complex real estate deal for you? Who's going to fudge the export papers? Like, unfortunately, and it's sad to say, but many of the times this is going to be a lawyer or a similar sort of gatekeeper professional that's involved. There are efforts in the U.S. In Congress to extend anti-money laundering responsibilities to lawyers and other gatekeeper professions, but it's been very difficult and there's been opposition. Some of it comes down to people saying, we don't want to get away in the way of this attorney-client's privilege, right? The information that a lawyer and client are discussing has to be always protected. Um, However, I think it's possible to do that and also ensure that lawyers don't launder money. I don't really agree with that argument.
Well, yeah, no, you mentioned Congress. Um, so I had a look at campaign contributions. Well, for example, Bob Menendez, who is in a bit of trouble because of alleged corruption. He raised $10.8 million between 2019 and 2024. 808,000 of that money came from law firms. 724,000 came from real estate firms, and another 584,000 came from securities and investment firms. Then you got another beautiful character in your political system called Marco Rubio, a senator. He raised $2.3 million between 2019 and 2024, got 1.8 million of real estate and 1.3 million of securities and investment firms. So I don't want to be too much of an anarchist, but don't you think that's where the problem is?
So at Fact Coalition, we're advocating to extend anti-money laundering to these sectors. And I don't have those data that you mentioned in front of me, but I think you can see what we're up against, right? We're up against
Yeah.
some very strong, powerful sectors that may not welcome additional anti-money laundering responsibilities or may not want to be further regulated. The challenge is real. That said, there have been things we've accomplished. I think that the Corporate Transparency Act is perhaps the greatest achievement
Yeah.
of my organization and of like-minded organizations. It's incredible that we managed to pass this. It's a really, really important achievement, and now we're pushing for a successful and meaningful implementation.
But when it comes to like the whole ecosystem of financial crimes and in particular like environmental crimes, like at one point you're going to have to like audit um, the money that enters political campaigns, but because it's going to be very difficult to get laws enacted like the Transparency Act, the Corporate Transparency Act. I'm sorry. Um, when you got senators who depend on exactly these firms in order to get legislation passed through Congress and get effective legislation passed through Congress. Or am I being too cynical?
No, I think that you're pointing to very real challenges that we face in our work. Without being too paranoid or sounding too alarmist, but I think that one of the challenges we see with environmental crime, which is my specific area of focus, is that it's much easier for law enforcement of countries in general to go after the small guys than to go
Yeah.
after the big guys. And I think it's some of the same dynamics that you point to. You know, it's issues of financing, it's issues of, you know, the revolving door. It's a whole host of things, but there are definitely some perverse incentives that make advocating for these issues very, very challenging.
But if there's no, if you don't look at like how congressmen benefit from this criminal activity, even if it's not indirectly, then it's really difficult to get effective legislation enacted. So you just mentioned like the real estate, how foreign companies. I mean, um, that's kind of insulting, isn't it? I mean, it's so obvious that you want to include foreign businesses into any legislation when it comes to anti-money laundering in real estate.
Yeah, I think that it's important to know who's behind, whether it's a real estate transaction, whether it's political donations. We want to know who's behind that. It's just a fundamental transparency measure. I think you're pointing to very real, very complex challenges that we have in the U.S. Um, I don't have an answer other than to say, you know, it's unfortunately it's the world we live in, and so as facts, we try to conduct advocacy to push for transparency the best we can, given these very significant constraints.
That was Julia Yansura of the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition. If you want to hear more podcasts of Colombia Reports or support the website, please go to the Patreon page on patreon.com/Colombia Reports.